So what I want to start with for the 8, we're going to focus on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is hormones being released from the hypothalamus, releasing hormones, triggering a response. But I want to start first with an overview of the stress response, because the hypothalamus controls the stress response in more than one way. So some of this is going to be a review, and this really helps things fit together in terms of what's the point. So if you have a stressor here, let's say you have a stressor, the processing for that, maybe it's coming in from the eyes, the visual system, it's processed by whatever sensory system, and oftentimes the amygdala is going to be involved. So you've probably heard of the amygdala in terms of fight or flight. We're not going to focus on that. Besides, you should just know that name. We talked about the amygdala a little bit in the fall as a brain region involved in anxiety, fear, fight or flight response. The hypothalamus, however, is actually going to be an output signal of the amygdala. So this is our hypothalamus here. Now this is confusing because this is a different brain region here. And this whole region right here is our hypothalamus. The amygdala is going to signal that. So this is our hypothalamus. It's a little confusing how I have that. So just remember, this region is the hypothalamus. The amygdala signals to that. Arrows can mean more than one thing. It's kind of annoying. I'm actually going to have this just be a line marking that that is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has lots of neurons, and shown here are the projections to where. You should know what this is. This is our anterior pituitary. And you can tell by the anatomy, this portal system here, and the axons end right at that location. There are also going to be neurons that project from the hypothalamus out to the spinal cord. Out meaning down, really, right? The spinal cord is down. Here's our spinal cord. Not my best spinal cord ever, but they can't all be the best ever. There's a synapse here, and it's going to go from the spinal cord then. Here's our central canal. Here's our second neuron. Where does the spinal cord project to? We're talking about the short-term stress response. It's going to project, remember, this is part of our autonomic nervous system. Oftentimes there is a second neuron chain. We're not going to go there right now. Right now, we're going to go to the adrenal medulla, the adrenal gland, and specifically, I'm actually going to have this go, so the medulla is the inside part, and this axon is going to go all the way down into the adrenal medulla. What's in the adrenal medulla? I'm going to switch colors here just to bury it up a little bit. There are cells, and those cells are going to produce what? Norepinephrine and epinephrine. These signaling molecules are going to go into the bloodstream because that's where they go from these cells here. You're going to go into the bloodstream. And this is going to be your fight or flight, quick ANS, short-term stress response, adrenaline, fight or flight. What are some effects of this? We're going to have increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased respiration, breathing, increased glucose mobilization, so glucose traveling around in our blood, all things that we need to be able to have to be able to fight or run from a bear. At the same time, these stress, so this is a short-term stress response, immediately run from that bear. At the same time, those same stressors cause these cells right here to release what? We've done this. This is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. You may not remember, corticotropin releasing hormone. So this is a second response to that stress. CRH is going to travel to the anterior pituitary and is going to signal the release of what? Adrenocorticotropin hormone. A hormone that is going to be a tropic hormone for the adrenal gland. This ACTH is going to travel through the bloodstream and is going to target what? The adrenal gland. But where? Actually, the cortex. The adrenal cortex contains other cells, still endocrine cells, that are going to release hormones, different hormones, right? These cells don't produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's not what they do. What do they produce? They're going to produce glucocorticoids, for example, cortisol. There's also mineral corticoids such as aldosterone. We'll come back to that with the urinary system. Cortisol is really the one I want you to focus on right now. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It's released in response to stress. It's going to have some similar effects to your adrenaline, but they're kind of more for long-term. So this is our long-term stress. So this is beneficial because if we are running from a bear, we want to be able to break down proteins and fats into what? Well, amino acids, fatty acids, glucose. So break down all foods. Glycogen is glucose, fat. So we're going to have increased blood glucose, increased amino acids for making new proteins, responding to that stress by building things, proteins that are needed for emergencies. Fats for ultimately being metabolized and more energy use. So ATP production through several of these. It's also going to maintain the blood pressure and suppress the immune system. And that you may have heard of corticosterone treatments are immune suppressants. And those are sometimes topical creams that suppress the immune system because they use their cortisol. So that's kind of a review / integration of what you already know, and that's the stress response. Let's look at this with this lovely picture here. So here is our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Corticotropin releasing hormone is produced in the hypothalamus. Here's CRH. What is this? This is a peptide. It's a peptide hormone. And it's produced here, travels down to the anterior pituitary, and is going to trigger ACTH. ACTH is also a peptide hormone. That means both of these hormones bind to G protein coupled receptors to have their effects. ACTH is going to bind to the adrenal gland. That's what's right here. And the adrenal gland is going to release cortisol. Here is cortisol. What is cortisol? This is a steroid hormone derived from cholesterol. It can pass right through cell membranes and is going to cause changes in gene expression. So the stress response, glucose metabolism, immune suppression is from cortisol binding to its receptor. So cortisol is going to bind to what's called on some target tissue, target cell. So maybe the liver, where there's glycogen stored. There are going to be glucocorticoid receptors that bind glucocorticoids, cortisol. So this receptor is present in various places throughout the body. It's going to be how cortisol exerts its effect. Glucocorticoid receptor acts as transcription factor. right? Does that make sense? Yeah, it does. Cortisol also feeds back to turn off signaling in the hypothalamus and pituitary. So, hey, the hypothalamus and pituitary, they both have glucocorticoid receptors as well. Cool, huh? Okay, let's draw this with the feedback. Oops, don't look at that. I want to draw it out first. So I'm going to go through and label these. Can you label these? So what's this region up here? This is the hypothalamus. What's it releasing? CRH. It's going to target the anterior pituitary, which releases ACTH. ACTH is going to target the adrenal cortex, part of the adrenal gland, which is going to release cortisol. Cortisol, which is going to then target tissues and cause a response. This is going to bind to glucocorticoid receptors, cause a response. Now we can see the nicer one. Looks like this. Same thing I drew. And the other important thing that's there is this negative feedback, right? So cortisol is the thing that's feeding back. The response addresses our stimulus. It fixes it, but it doesn't directly turn off the system. It's going to stop it from responding. But the negative feedback actually is coming from cortisol acting at the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. They contain receptors that bind to cortisol. So these can become, the dysregulation that occurs in anxiety and depression is very complex. We're going to be looking at something a little simpler in terms of dysfunction of an organ in this pathway and its result on cortisol levels. So one of these examples is Cushing syndrome. Cushing syndrome is marked by weight gain, hair growth, easily bruising, and fatigue. And this is caused by high levels of cortisol. So Cushing syndrome, the indicator of it is high cortisol, the cause of it, and these are some of the symptoms. So I want you to think about high cortisol, okay? What could cause that? So here's two questions. What structures could be dysfunctional, theoretically, to cause high cortisol? Draw out the HPA axis and show where this dysfunction could occur and whether that's causing hormones to be high or low. So one obvious answer probably is the adrenal cortex, right? That could be dysregulated, but there's more options than that. Draw out 3 HPA axes, and try to fill in where there could be dysfunction. So we've got various types of Cushing syndrome. Primary is when there's a problem with the adrenal cortex. This might be the most obvious, maybe. So you've got, I'm going to draw, let's see. I'm going to just write the hormones. No, I'm going to write okay, I'll write the body part. Hypothalamus. This is releasing CRH. The anterior pituitary. You should be really comfortable writing this. Adrenal cortex. So let's say that there is some pathology in the adrenal cortex. I'm going to mark this with a little star here. That's what we said here. Primary Cushing syndrome is a problem in the adrenal cortex. What's the problem? Well, it's releasing too much cortisol, right? Maybe there's a tumor that's made of adrenal cortex tissue, producing too much. This cortisol is going to feed back, however, and find another color here, turn off production from the pituitary and hypothalamus, but it doesn't matter, right? Because cortisol is still too high. So this is going to be pretty low, And this is going to, sorry, ACTH I never drew on here. That's also low, but that's great, okay. But we still have a problem, high cortisol. Okay, let's do secondary. So secondary Cushing syndrome is due to a problem in the pituitary. So in this case, we've still got the same structures. Let's not forget ACTH. We are still targeting the adrenal cortex. And I'm going to draw in red again the cortisol, because red is meaning too high. Cushing syndrome is indicated by high cortisol. However, in this case, the pathology is here at the anterior pituitary gland. So what that means is this is producing too much ACTH. It's not listening. So I'm actually going to have this also have a high there. It could be either not listening to feedback, going this way. So this is still trying to feed back here, but maybe the cells that are supposed to be responding to cortisol aren't working. So there could be a dysfunctional glucocorticoid receptor, for example, or maybe there's a tumor in the anterior pituitary that's overproducing ACTH. You also can have a pituitary somewhere else in the body that produces ACTH, in which case it's kind of a related but with different problem. So does that make sense? CRH is still low. It's still trying to turn off the system, but the anterior pituitary is not listening. Too much ACTH is produced. The adrenal cortex is just doing its job. It's just producing cortisol in response to ACTH. Okay, lastly is dysfunction in the hypothalamus. And this is more rare. It's also harder to measure because you can't actually measure CRH very well because it's in that portal system. So same anatomy. And cortisol is still going to be high, too high. And it's still maybe trying to feed back, but that feedback isn't working. So I'm actually going to cross this out. That's one common cause of this. So cortisol, there's a lot of it, but feedback is not working, is the typical cause of this. So CRH is too high. Hypothalamus isn't turning off like it's supposed to. It's supposed to stop releasing the releasing hormone, but it's not. Therefore, ACTH is too high. Therefore, cortisol is too high. Again, this one's a little bit more rare. You may be a tumor that's secreting CRH in the hypothalamus. So maybe some negative feedback is working, but there's just too much being produced. There can be variable causes, right? So this is, first of all, when you have something like Cushing syndrome, wanting to identify where the problem is. So you can do this by measuring ACTH and cortisol. You can try to measure CRH as well. That will help tell you where the problem is. You still need to find out maybe the cause of the problem. So maybe imaging for a tumor. There's also some other like tests you can do with administering cortisol and looking at suppression of the system, etc.